So this past week, bombshell hit Hollywood in the way of the James Bond franchise as it was revealed that Amazon MGM Studios has now gained full creative control over the James Bond franchise moving forward. Now, people listening, I don't know how much people are in tune or know about the James Bond franchise in terms of how the movies are made or how things are
Hmm.
developed, but historically, James Bond, the intellectual property on a theatrical side of things, has been controlled primarily by one family. That's the Broccoli family. They've been in charge of the James Bond franchise dating all the way back to the 60s when the first James Bond film landed in theaters, Dr. No, of course, starring Sean Connery. And ever since then, the family has maintained control of the franchise. But all of that changed just a couple of years ago. And I want to read a report from Deadline as we start to dive into the story and unpack everything that this might mean for the future of the James Bond franchise. But when this news broke this past Thursday, Deadline published this and said, quote, in news that will send shockwaves through the industry, longtime James Bond producers Michael G. Wilson and Barbara Broccoli are relinquishing control of the beloved spy franchise and handing the reins to Amazon MGM Studios. As part of the arrangement revealed this past Thursday, Amazon and the producers have formed a new joint venture to house the Bond intellectual property rights, with Broccoli and Wilson remaining co-owners of the franchise. Under terms of the new venture, Amazon MGM Studios will gain creative control of 007. Deadline would then also go on to create an additional report about some of the financial implications regarding this transaction. And they said this, quote, it's taking around $1 billion to have 007 stewards Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson cede creative oversight of their family story James Bond franchise to Amazon MGM Studios, sources tell Deadline. Amazon originally overpaid on its purchase of MGM in a deal orchestrated by them MGM board chair Kevin Ulrich. Though valued between $3.5 and $4 billion, the legendary motion picture studio was absorbed by the streamer for $8.5 billion. The hefty sum propped up by the potential access of the 007 franchise. However, Amazon couldn't fully freely develop Bond with Broccoli and Wilson in the mix. Hence, it took another $1 billion to ensure that they could fully steer and exploit the Ian Fleming IP. End quote. So this is a major, major story in Hollywood, and James Bond is one of the largest, most successful, most lucrative franchises that we have had for the better part of 60 plus years now. But it has been a few years since the last James Bond film, No Time to Die, starring Daniel Craig, and his last outing as James Bond came out about 3.5 years ago. And in that time, Amazon MGM purchased MGM, excuse me, and they acquired the intellectual property rights of Bond alongside with that. But the Broccoli family, Barbara
Hmm.
and Michael G. Wilson, they have been there
Yeah.
to continue to steer the franchise forward. But now, after a few years, after what seems to be no movement on a new Bond franchise, or at least a new star or a new
Hmm.
story, it seems like Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, they have decided to step back and finally just give up control, which for their father, Cubby Broccoli, who really controlled Bond for decades, he might be rolling in his grave. I don't know, but this is definitely a big, big shocker in terms of Hollywood. There's a couple of ways to look at this from, but just what are your initial reactions to this? How are you feeling about this news? What do you think about Amazon now having full creative control of James Bond?
I feel absolutely terrible about it. This isn't good news at all to me. Nothing about this makes me excited or happy or gives me any reason, I think, to be I think interested really in the future of the James Bond franchise. Like, not only is the Broccoli family that you mentioned not being involved anymore, but the way this came about, the fact that this franchise is now belongs to somebody like Amazon, is just, there's nothing good that feels good about this at all. It feels like the death, honestly, of James Bond. And I remember when No Time to Die came out, everybody was like, "Dang, this does feel like a very definitive end to Daniel's Craig Bond." But is that like the real our last real Bond movie we're about to get? Because whatever comes out of this, I can't imagine it's going to feel good or just be in the best interest of the character. Because the Broccoli family was involved, it felt like there was some form of integrity, something to hold on to make those Bond movies, I think, you know, feel the way they felt. But now with this, the way this feels and the way this thing went down, man, I'm not excited at all. I don't think this is good at all by any means. Of course, Amazon, you're like, they're about to make all this money, or they're going to try to attempt to make money from the Bond franchise. But this is an example of studio. trying to make money and not trying to make a good film. They're buying a franchise to get eyeballs and not to actually make something good of it. So yeah, it doesn't feel good at all to me. It feels like a lot of corporate bullshit that it doesn't feel good at all to me, man. I don't like it one bit.
Well, I don't know if we can say that just yet, and you'll never really hear me play devil's advocate on the part of a streamer, but I
Yeah.
will say that we've yet to see anything from them. We don't know what their
Hmm.
intentions are in terms of quality assurance, quality control with the Bond franchise. We don't have a product to actually judge it based on anything. There has been
Yeah.
no movement on any story, any actors, so there's not really any choices to judge whether or not Amazon actually cares about the integrity of the franchise, cares about the quality, or just the I guess the
Hmm.
specialty of the franchise,
Right. Right.
which is the thing that really kind of alarms me first and foremost, because historical knowledge would tell us that most of the time these big corporate companies, when they absorb any big piece of intellectual property, they are going to mine it for what it's worth. They are going to
Yeah.
figure out a way to extrapolate as much value out of it as they can, as they
Hmm.
should. When you pay $8.5 billion for something, you're looking to get a return on that investment. However, that
Hmm.
doesn't remove the fact that this is one of the last few franchises that I think we still had that still felt special. We would get
Hmm.
Bond movies every couple of years, every few years, but because it was really under the stewardship of Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, people who are notoriously known for taking their time and not rushing these movies, and really, I think for better and for worse, being very, very, very disciplined about how they would actually proceed with these films, we wouldn't get them that often, and they would still feel like cinematic events. You know, every time out,
Yeah.
they would still feel like cinematic events, and I think that that's something that we've lost sight of a lot in Hollywood. You know, you can look at any
Hmm.
franchise and you can see anything that's been absorbed. Star Wars is a great example of something that's been watered down over the
Yeah.
past 10 or so years because of the acquisition of Disney. This actually mirrors a lot of what happened with George Lucas when Lucasfilm was acquired by Disney. And so my natural inclination is to say this could very much be a very bad thing. This could be really alarming.
Hmm.
Like, let's get ready for 7 spinoffs and 3 prequels and a Blowfield origin story and a Spectre series. And there's probably going to be a gadget
Yeah.
game show, all sorts of like silly shit that I, personally I don't care to see.
Yeah.
But at the same time, what I will say is that Amazon, if you look at what they've already acquired historically,
Hmm.
they're doing pretty well, if you ask me. Like, if you look at things such as Reacher, that's a show that I love.
True.
Cross was a pretty solid show. What else have they done? They've done The Boys and Invincible. Those are acquisitions. People
Hmm.
love those shows and what they've done to sort of reinvent those franchises and bring them to an entirely new generation. There's other things like Jack Ryan, a pretty solid show. I watched the first season. It's a pretty solid show and a pretty solid adaptation of that particular character. So they've taken
Hmm.
some swings before and they've worked. Even something like Mr. and Mrs. Smith, also
Yeah.
something
For sure.
adjacently related to the Spy franchise. I think their biggest miss thus far has been The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. That first
Hmm.
season was not it, but did watch the second season. They turned it around. They certainly, I think, heard a lot of the backlash, took some notes, went back to the drawing board. That second season is certainly an improvement over the first season, and it feels
Hmm.
like it's heading in the right direction. But at the same time, like conventional wisdom would tell us, like, now Bond is probably not going to have that same special feeling that it used to, because it likely may be watered down. It just may be watered
Hmm.
down because we might get all of these different spin-offs and all sorts of different things that nobody's necessarily asking for, but because you
Hmm.
spend so much money on a character and on an IP in this way, they're looking to make movement on it. But I think that this is a really crazy development, because it is kind of the last franchise that was being held out by a family, by an estate.
Yeah.
That's not really a thing
Hmm.
anymore. Every big well-known IP that we have is kind of transitioned. But I do also want to ask this about Bond, because Bond has been around for 63 years.
Yeah.
This is probably the longest cinematic franchise about a single character, I think, in existence. I don't know if there's a longer franchise. 25 official films, technically
Yeah.
27 if you count the non-Eon produced ones. A lot of movies, 6 different actors have stepped into the role. This is all based on literary source material as well. There are
Yep.
books on that stuff. But in that time, a lot's changed. We have new franchises like Mission Impossible,
Hmm.
Bourne is coming on. These things that are happening on TV, like Mr. and Mrs. Smith. There's other spy shows out there right now. Zero Day. I'm going to talk about that later. There's other things like The Day of the Jackal. Like there's all sorts of stuff that is sort of taking the place in
Yeah,
some respects of what Bond used to occupy, which is
for
it's
sure.
kind of ironic because Bond in the 60s was so groundbreaking. It spawned, I mean, hundreds of ripoffs. Like it
Yep,
created a whole new
so many.
subgenre. But
Hmm.
now it's almost been, I don't want to say lapped, but it's almost being outpaced by some of these other franchises in some
Hmm.
respects and maybe playing catch up. Do you think that something like this could potentially revitalize Bond? Not that it necessarily needs that. Those films that just came out with Daniel Craig, still super successful, still made a
Yeah.
lot of money.
Hmm.
I wasn't a fan of a couple of them, but they were still very successful. But I don't know, in terms of just like the look and feel, the creative direction of it, the character itself, it's kind of a character that's been somewhat stuck in the past if you think about it.
That's true.
Historically a sexist, historically a misogynist,
Yep.
definitely a character created in the Cold War, a lot of old thinking and
Hmm.
ideas. Do you think that there might be something to be said about what they could do with the future of the character in terms of modernizing it or even reinventing it and doing something that we just haven't seen before?
And I think that is my one thing that I'm like, okay, they, if done correctly, they could change the landscape of what Bond is supposed to look like or can look like or what that feel can look like. And honestly, in the same way that how different Mr. and Mrs. Smith the TV show is from the movie that we know, like it's a very different thing, that we're seeing. And also to your point, it has kind of a lot going up against it from all the spawn, the spawn that they've created. We've talked about several other kind of spy shows on here. I'm even thinking about something recent like Day of the Jackal that seems to be pretty popular around this time, or the other show. Yeah, just a lot of different shows that kind of are fitting that space or fitting that espionage spy niche that Bond usually fits. And so I think that what also makes me afraid of that is the undertaking is like I do think it has potential to change, to be different, but I do think it's going to be hard, and they got to put a lot of thought into it to shake up what Bond is and what it could look like coming in the new age now under this new leadership, man. So I think it's possible for it to be different, for it to change. But yeah, I just think it's going to be a big undertaking. It's going to take some focus, and but yeah, very possible for sure.
And I think fans have to ask themselves, is that something that they even want? Do they want change? Do they want the character to represent something different than historically what it's been? Because
Hmm.
Bond has chased trends before. This
For
isn't
sure.
something that it's been doing it for decades. Like even in the 70s when the Roger Moore films came around, they
Hmm.
made Live and Let Die, that was chasing the black exploitation movie. Then The
Yeah.
Spy Who Loved Me came along, that was chasing martial arts movies of the 70s.
Hmm.
Moonraker came out right after Star Wars. And then
Hmm.
you fast forward all the way until the Daniel Craig movies. After Casino Royale, you get Quantum of Solace. They completely reshaped and re-edited that movie to resemble a Bourne movie. And I
Yeah.
think it faltered and failed because of it. Honestly, Skyfall, as much as I love it, that's kind of a Dark Knight ripoff, if we're being honest. And
Hmm.
so these are movies, and it's been a franchise that has been somewhat trying to play catch up, I think, in certain respects.
Yeah.
And I think that they have to really, really hone in on what distinguishes Bond from everything else, what's always distinguished Bond from
Hmm.
everything else. And that's a lot of the stories. That's all of the things that we associate with the franchise, the villains, the gadgets, the Bond girls, the songs, the intros. All of these things are very
Hmm.
unique to Bond that have been super creative outlets that you can't get anywhere else. And I think that they have to obviously refocus on those things and make sure that they maintain all of that stuff. Like don't change up any of those
Yeah.
formulaic elements that have just proven to work. But the
Hmm.
story in and of itself is going to be really, really crucial. And what I'm most curious to see is, do they continue down the trend of what they tried to do with Craig and do more serialized storytelling, which we saw in those recent
Hmm.
movies, which I don't know if that was honestly the best way to go. One of the joys
Hmm.
about the Bond franchise is the fact that you can watch anyone individually and don't have to
Randomly.
see
Yeah.
anything
Hmm.
before. But
Yeah.
that all changed with the Daniel Craig movies for the most part, because they started to connect those dots and connect the
Hmm.
story threads. So I don't know if they continue down that route, because that's
Yeah.
been sort of the trend in modern day storytelling, or if they maybe revert back to something that historically has just worked a little bit more in its favor. And then, of course, just the casting of the character is just going to be, that's just going to be paramount of who steps into the role. And now there's going to be even more pressure on who that individual is. It was already an insurmountable amount of pressure, but now considering that Amazon is in control of this stuff, it's going to be even more amplified. So I'm very concerned. I don't need Bond TV shows and prequels and spinoffs and all of those things. Like, I don't really care about any of that shit. Movies at the end of the day are what I'm concerned about, and Amazon hasn't really shown a ton of investment in the theatrical side of things, but I don't know. I'm hoping that they make somewhat of an exception as they start to take control of Bond. So we will certainly have to see as we find out more news about this James Bond information. But